The past self you ignore is sabotaging your present. Trauma pattern recognition. Carl Jung. The saboteur. You cannot see you have done the work. You have read the books, had the conversations, perhaps spent years in therapy or in quiet self-reflection. You know your patterns. You can name them. You can trace them back, more or less, to where they began. And still, with all of that awareness, you find yourself here again. In the same kind of relationship that hurts, in the same kind of way. Making the same choice you swore you would never make again. Feeling the same feeling you thought you had finally moved past. If this sounds familiar, I want you to understand something before we go any further. You are not weak. You are not broken. And the fact that you keep returning to these patterns is not evidence of a character flaw or a lack of genuine effort. It is evidence of something much more specific and much more treatable than that. It is evidence of a past self that has never been properly seen. Carl Gustav Jung spent the better part of his life studying this exact phenomenon, the way the unprocessed experiences of the past continue to organize the present without the conscious mind's permission or awareness. He called this process the compulsion to repeat, and he understood it with a clarity that very few have matched before or since. The patterns that sabotage your life are not random. They are not weaknesses of character. They are the logical, coherent, deeply consistent output of a past self that is still operating inside you, a version of you formed in the crucible of early experience, shaped by pain that was never fully metabolized, and still running the same survival strategies that kept you intact when you were too young and too powerless to do anything else. The past self is not a memory. That is the first and most important thing to understand. Memories can be processed, revisited, filed away. The past self is something different. It is an active psychological presence, a configuration of beliefs, emotional reflexes, and perceptual filters that were formed under conditions of stress or threat, and became, over time, the operating system through which you experience the present. It does not announce itself. It does not say, "I'm afraid because something that happened 20 years ago taught me that love is followed by abandonment." It simply makes you pull back from the person who is getting too close. It does not say, "I am reacting from shame because I was humiliated repeatedly as a child for being too emotional." It simply makes you go cold and hard the moment someone touches the wound. This is what Jung called unconscious pattern repetition, and it is not a malfunction, or rather it was a form of intelligence. The past self was forged in conditions that required certain adaptations. It learned what was safe and what was dangerous. It learned what to do with vulnerability, with need, with the desire for connection. It learned these things in the only school available to it at the time, the early environment, with its specific rules, its specific absences, and its specific forms of pain. The tragedy is not that this past self exists. The tragedy is that it was never updated. It is still operating with the same information it had then, still making decisions based on a world that may no longer exist, still protecting you from wounds that may have already closed, while simultaneously preventing you from accessing the life, the love, and the freedom that is now genuinely available. This video is about learning to see it, to recognize its fingerprints in your most automatic reactions, your most persistent patterns, and your deepest and most inexplicable fears. Because you cannot integrate what you cannot see, and you cannot stop repeating what you have never fully understood. Jung believed, and decades of psychological research have confirmed, that the moment of genuine recognition is not just an intellectual event. It is a turning point. It is the moment the unconscious loses its stranglehold on the present. And it begins here. How the past self is formed. To understand why the past self is so powerful, you have to understand the conditions under which it was built. Jung's model of the psyche was not linear. He did not understand psychological development as a simple progression from wounded child to healed adult. He understood it as a layered, dynamic process, one in which early experiences do not simply influence later ones, but become encoded into the structure of the psyche itself, shaping the very lens through which all subsequent experience is perceived and interpreted. The past self begins forming long before consciousness is sophisticated enough to question it. In the earliest years of life, the nervous system is in a state of extraordinary sensitivity and plasticity. The brain is not yet capable of abstract reasoning, of contextualizing experience, of separating the event from the meaning the event seems to carry. A child who experiences consistent emotional unavailability from a caregiver does not conclude, "My parent is struggling with their own unresolved trauma and is therefore limited in their capacity for attunement." A child concludes, "I am not enough to make someone stay present." A child who is punished for expressing certain emotions does not think, "The adults around me are uncomfortable with their own emotional life." A child learns, "These feelings are dangerous. These feelings make me unlovable." These are not thoughts. They are not beliefs in the cognitive sense. They are imprints. They become part of the architecture of the developing self, the unconscious assumptions about the world, about relationships, about the self, that form the invisible background against which all future experience is evaluated. Jung called this accumulated material the personal unconscious. It is distinct from the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of archetypes and universal human experience, but it is equally powerful in its influence on daily life. The personal unconscious is the repository of everything that was experienced but not fully processed, everything that was felt but could not be expressed, everything that happened but had to be adapted to, without the resources that adequate support would have provided. And within the personal unconscious, the past self organizes itself around what Jung called complexes. A complex is not a casual psychological term. For Jung, it was a precise description of a specific psychic structure, a cluster of emotionally charged experiences, memories, and beliefs organized around a central emotional theme. The abandonment complex, the shame complex, the worthlessness complex, the complex around love being dangerous, or around success being followed by punishment, or around visibility being equivalent to attack. Each complex has a core emotional charge, the original wound, and a set of satellite associations that have accumulated around it over time. And each complex behaves, in a very real sense, like an autonomous personality within the psyche. When it is activated, it does not merely influence your reaction, it temporarily takes over. It hijacks the present moment and replaces your adult perception with the emotional reality of the past self, the child or adolescent or young adult who first formed the complex under conditions of genuine distress. This is why intellectual understanding is so often insufficient. You can know analytically that the person you are in conflict with is not your critical father. You can remind yourself in your adult voice that being overlooked in a meeting is not the same as being made invisible throughout your entire childhood. But if the complex is activated, that knowledge is temporarily irrelevant. The past self is in charge, and the past self does not operate in the present. It operates in the moment the complex was formed. This is not a failure of willpower. It is the precise, predictable behavior of a psychic structure that was built to protect you and has never been shown that the threat it was built for is no longer present. The question is not whether you have these complexes. Everyone does. The question is whether they remain unconscious, running your life from the shadows, or whether they become known to you, named, recognized, and ultimately integrated. Jung believed the latter was not only possible, but necessary for genuine psychological health, and the path toward it begins with one of the most important skills in all of depth psychology, the ability to recognize your own patterns before they have already run their course. The fingerprints of the past self. The past self does not leave obvious traces. It does not announce its presence with a clear, legible signal. It works through subtlety, through the reactions that seem just slightly too large for the situation, through the recurring scenarios that always seem to involve other people's failures, through the decisions that feel completely rational in the moment and inexplicable in retrospect. Learning to recognize it is less like reading a map and more like learning a new language. A language made not of words but of patterns, of emotional signatures, of the specific, repeating shapes that your unconscious psychology takes in the world. Jung identified several of the most common and most significant of these patterns. The first is disproportionate emotional reaction. This is one of the most reliable indicators that the past self has been activated. When a response, anger, grief, fear, shame, arrives with an intensity that does not match the actual weight of the present situation, That disproportionality is almost always a signal, not that the emotion is wrong or invalid, but that the emotion belongs, at least partially, to a different moment than the one being experienced. The person who was slightly dismissive of you in a meeting did not cause your distress. They activated an old wound of being unseen that the past self has been carrying for decades. The difference matters, because responding to the old wound through the present situation will always make things worse and will always confuse everyone involved, including you. The second pattern is repetition of relational dynamics. Jung was fascinated by the compulsion to repeat, the way individuals consistently recreate in their adult relationships the emotional dynamics of their early attachment experiences. This is not masochism. It is not stupidity. It is the psyche's attempt to resolve what was never resolved, to finally get a different outcome in a situation that feels, at the unconscious level, identical to the original one. The person who keeps choosing emotionally unavailable partners is not simply making poor decisions. The past self is drawn to the familiar emotional territory of unmet need, because it is in that territory that the core wound lives, and it is there, not in relationships that feel easy and safe, that the unconscious believes resolution is possible. Until the pattern is recognized and the underlying wound addressed, the cast may change, but the story will not. The third pattern is self-sabotage at the threshold of expansion. This is perhaps the most painful and most puzzling of all the ways the past self operates, the promotion that arrives and somehow seems to slip away, the relationship that was finally going well and then inexplicably was undermined, the creative project that reached the edge of real visibility and then was abandoned. Jung understood this pattern with piercing clarity. The past self does not only carry wounds around pain and loss, it often carries an equally deep wound around success, visibility, and the daring to want something fully. For many people, the original environment made desire dangerous. Wanting too much led to humiliation. Being too bright led to punishment. Taking up too much space led to rejection. The past self learned to pull back at the threshold, and it continues to do so, automatically, invisibly, with complete conviction, every time the adult self approaches the edge of genuine expansion. The fourth pattern is the internal critic as echo. One of the most consistent features of the past self is the way it internalizes the voices that originally caused the wound. The critical parent becomes an internal critic. The dismissive teacher becomes the voice that tells you your ideas are not worth sharing. The environment that punished vulnerability becomes the internal authority that demands you present only strength. These voices are not you. They are the accumulated deposit of other people's unresolved psychology, taken in at a time when you had no defenses against them, but they speak in the first person. They say, "I am not enough, I am too much, I will never be able to," and they are believed, automatically, consistently, precisely because they feel like truth rather than pattern. Recognizing these fingerprints is not about cataloging your damage. It is about developing what Jung called psychological consciousness, the capacity to observe yourself with enough precision and enough compassion to distinguish between your authentic present-moment response and the automatic output of the past self, between who you actually are and who you were shaped to believe you were. This distinction is not just intellectually interesting, it is the beginning of freedom. Why awareness alone is not enough. There is a widespread belief in contemporary psychological culture that awareness is the primary instrument of change, that if you can name the pattern, you can release it. That insight in itself is transformative. Jung would have agreed, and partly. Awareness is essential. Without it, the unconscious operates without any counterweight whatsoever. But Jung also understood something that many modern approaches underestimate. The unconscious is not transformed by being observed. It is transformed by being engaged, by being entered, by a quality of inner work that goes significantly deeper than naming what is wrong. This is why so many people find themselves in a paradox. They have spent years developing genuine self-awareness. They can articulate their patterns with precision. They can trace the origin of their wounds with considerable accuracy. And yet, the patterns persist. The wound activates just as reliably as it always did. The past self remains in charge at the exact moments when the adult most needs to be present. The reason for this is not a failure of insight. It is the nature of where these patterns live. Trauma, and Jung used this word in its broadest sense, not only for catastrophic events, but for any experience that overwhelmed the psyche's capacity to process and integrate, does not primarily live in the mind. It lives in the body. It lives in the nervous system. It lives in the automatic, precognitive responses that fire before thought is even possible. It lives in the somatic memory that holds what the conscious mind may have already processed, but the body has not. This is why you can understand something completely and still be undone by it. You can know with absolute certainty that the fear you are experiencing is not proportionate to the present situation, and still feel it as if it were. Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a whole integrated person, was never a purely cognitive process. It required active engagement with the unconscious, through dreams, through active imagination, through the embodied experience of emotional truth rather than simply its conceptual understanding. The past self is not healed by being understood from a distance. It is healed by being met from within. And this is where many people reach the limit of what solitary intellectual effort can accomplish. There comes a point in genuine psychological work where the path forward requires a structured process, a container for the kind of inner engagement that changes not just what you think but how you are organized at a deeper level. A process that does not simply describe the patterns but provides daily, specific, embodied practices for beginning to interrupt them, for developing over time the new responses that gradually replace the automatic ones. Jung was explicit. The unconscious does not yield to abstract understanding alone. It yields to sustained, intentional, consistent engagement, to the kind of daily inner work that accumulates, not dramatically, not suddenly, but over time, into genuine and lasting change. 20 days, the research consistently shows, is the minimum threshold at which the conscious mind begins to integrate new patterns. Not the endpoint, the beginning. The point at which new neural pathways have been reinforced enough times to start competing with the old automatic ones. That is exactly the length of the process I developed in transformation with the Teachings of Carl Jung. Not a book about Jung in the academic sense, but a guided daily practice for applying these principles to the actual texture of your life. Each day builds on the last. Each practice engages a different dimension of the inner work Jung described. And the cumulative effect for those who commit to it is not just a better understanding of themselves, it is a genuinely different relationship with themselves. The link is in the description. If what you have been hearing in this video resonates with something real in your experience that is worth paying attention to. The shadow and the past self. No exploration of the past self would be complete without engaging the concept that sits at the very heart of Jungian psychology, the shadow. The shadow is not, as it is sometimes popularly described, simply the dark side of the personality. It is more precise and more significant than that. The shadow is everything about the self that was rejected, not because it was inherently negative, but because it was deemed unacceptable by the early environment, and therefore exiled from consciousness. The past self and the shadow are deeply intertwined. In fact, much of what constitutes the past self, the emotional responses that were punished, the needs that were shamed, the qualities that were dismissed, ends up in the shadow, not because they were genuinely unworthy, but because they were treated as if they were. The child who was told their sensitivity was weakness does not simply discard their sensitivity. They bury it in the shadow. The adolescent whose ambition was mocked does not lose their drive. It goes underground. The young adult whose anger frightened everyone around them does not stop feeling angry. They learn to suppress it so completely that it becomes, in the shadow, a force of considerable destructive power. And here is the dynamic that Jung described with remarkable precision. What is in the shadow does not stay in the shadow. It projects. Projection is the mechanism by which the disowned contents of the self are experienced not as inner realities, but as external ones. The person who has buried their own capacity for rage encounters it everywhere in others, explosive, dangerous, threatening. The person who has exiled their own neediness finds others unbearably needy. The person who has suppressed their own ambition is constantly surrounded by people who seem arrogant and self-promoting. The projection is not deliberate, it is not conscious, It is the automatic consequence of the shadow's presence. What we refuse to see in ourselves, we will see in the world around us, and we will react to it there, with the full emotional charge of the unprocessed feeling, without ever recognizing that the source is internal. This is one of the most revelatory aspects of Jung's psychology, because it means that the people and situations that trigger you most intensely are not simply external irritants. They are mirrors. They are reflecting back to you a dimension of your own psychology that has been living in the shadow, and that is trying, through the distorted medium of projection, to be finally acknowledged. The colleague whose arrogance fills you with disproportionate contempt may be reflecting the ambition you were shamed into abandoning. The partner whose emotional distance drives you to despair may be reflecting the part of you that learned to be unavailable as a form of self-protection. The friend whose neediness exhausts you may be reflecting the need in yourself that was so thoroughly punished that you dismantled your capacity to express it. Recognizing projection is not about self-blame. It is not about deciding that your genuine grievances are illusions. It is about developing the capacity to ask, in moments of intense emotional reaction, the question Jung considered essential. What is this showing me about myself? That question, practiced consistently over time, is one of the most transformative tools in the entire Jungian framework, because it redirects the energy of the reaction, which would otherwise be spent entirely in the external world, toward the internal dimension where the real work is waiting. The past self is revealed over and over, through what we project, through what we cannot tolerate in others, through the recurring emotional weather of our daily lives, and each of these revelations is an invitation, not to more self-criticism or more analysis, but to genuine integration, to bringing the exiled parts of the self back into the light of consciousness, where they can be understood, accepted, and ultimately freed. Trauma pattern recognition in daily life. Understanding the theory is one thing. Applying it in the actual moments of your life, when the pattern is active, when the past self has taken over, when the emotional charge of an old wound is running through the present moment, is something else entirely. Jung never intended his psychology to remain in the consulting room. He understood individuation as a daily practice embedded in the ordinary texture of lived experience, the dreams you wake up from, the conversation that left you unsettled in a way you cannot quite explain, the moment of inexplicable resistance that appeared just when something good was about to begin. Trauma pattern recognition is the practice of learning to read these signals in real time, not in retrospect after the damage is done, but in the moment, or as close to the moment as possible, when the past self is beginning to activate. There are several practices that build this capacity over time. The first is the pause before the reaction. This is deceptively simple and extraordinarily difficult in practice. In the moment of emotional activation, the nervous system wants to move immediately, toward fight, toward flight, toward the habitual coping strategy that the past self has relied upon since it was first formed. The practice is to introduce, between the stimulus and the response, even a fraction of a second of conscious awareness. A breath. An internal question. Is this present or is this old? Not to suppress the emotion, suppression is precisely what created the problem in the first place, but to create enough space between the feeling and the action for the adult self to make a conscious choice rather than an automatic one. Over time, this pause extends. What begins as a fraction of a second becomes a few seconds, then a few minutes. The past self's activation becomes recognizable before it has fully taken over, and that recognition changes everything. Not because the emotion disappears, but because it is no longer operating in the dark. The second practice is pattern journaling. Not journaling in the sense of narrating events, but a specific structured practice of tracking the recurring emotional signatures of your day. When did you feel a disproportionate reaction? What was the trigger? What does this remind you of? Where in your body did you feel it? This practice, done consistently, begins to reveal the map of your complexes, the specific triggers, the specific emotional responses, the specific patterns that constitute the fingerprints of your past self. The pattern that seemed random begins to show itself as consistent. The wound that felt mysterious becomes increasingly legible. The third practice is somatic awareness. Because the past self lives in the body as much as in the mind, learning to track the body's signals is essential. the tightening in the chest that precedes conscious awareness of anxiety, the sudden exhaustion that arrives when boundaries need to be set, the restlessness that appears when genuine intimacy is approaching. The body often knows before the mind does that the past self is being activated. Learning to read these signals, not as problems to be solved but as information to be understood, is one of the most direct pathways into the unconscious available in ordinary daily life. The fourth is the confrontation with your projections. When someone or something triggers an intense emotional reaction, the practice is to hold the projection long enough to ask, if this quality I am seeing in them is also in me, hidden, exiled, disowned, what would that mean? What part of myself am I looking at through the distorted lens of this reaction? This practice requires courage. It requires the willingness to be temporarily wrong about the external situation in order to discover something true about the internal one. But it is, consistently, one of the practices that produces the most rapid and the most genuine insight into the structure of the past self. These practices are not cures. They are not moments of breakthrough that end the work. They are daily acts of engagement with the unconscious, consistent, patient, humble, that accumulate over time into something that cannot be achieved any other way, a genuinely different relationship with yourself. When the past self becomes an ally. Here is the truth about the past self that is most frequently missed and most important to understand. It was never your enemy. The patterns that now seem to be sabotaging your life were not mistakes. They were solutions. Extraordinarily adaptive solutions to conditions that were genuinely difficult, conditions that a developing child had limited resources to navigate without adapting in exactly the ways you adapted. The past self in its formation was an act of psychological survival. The problem was never the past self's existence. The problem was its persistence beyond the conditions that created it, its inability, without conscious intervention, to recognize that the world has changed, that you are no longer the child who needed those protections, that the adults in your life are no longer the caregivers who made intimacy dangerous, that the vulnerability you learned to hide is no longer the liability it once was. Integration does not mean erasing the past self. It does not mean defeating it, silencing it, or finally escaping from it. Jung was precise and explicit about this. The goal of individuation is not the elimination of the wound, but the expansion of the self to include it. To hold the past self, its fears, its adaptations, its accumulated pain, within a psychic container large enough and strong enough to contain all of it without being overwhelmed by any of it. This is what genuine psychological wholeness looks like. Not a person without wounds, a person in whom the wounds have been seen, named, felt, and integrated, transformed from unconscious governors of behavior into conscious sources of depth, empathy, and understanding. Because this is the unexpected truth about the past self. Once it is genuinely integrated, it becomes one of your greatest assets. The person who has done the deep work of recognizing and integrating their abandonment wound does not become someone who no longer values connection. They become someone who values it with a clarity and a depth that only genuine understanding of loss can produce. The person who has integrated their shame complex does not become shameless. They become someone with an unusually finely calibrated moral sensitivity, the capacity to feel genuine accountability without being destroyed by it. The person who has integrated their pattern of self-sabotage at the threshold of expansion does not lose their caution. They develop a nuanced relationship with risk, neither reckless nor paralyzed, but genuinely free to choose. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not perfection, not the transcendence of the human condition, but the full conscious inhabitation of who you actually are, including everything that was formed in pain, everything that was exiled in shame, everything that was buried because it seemed too much or not enough. The past self integrated does not sabotage your present, it informs it. It brings the hard-won knowledge of what genuine pain feels like and makes you someone who can recognize it in others with compassion rather than judgment. It brings the memory of what it is to feel unseen and makes you someone who knows how to offer the quality of seeing that changes a life. It brings the long history of survival and makes you someone who knows, at the deepest possible level, what you are actually capable of. This is the alchemy Jung described, the transformation of suffering into resource, of wound into wisdom, of the saboteur into the guide, and it does not happen automatically. It does not happen with time alone or with understanding alone. It happens through the willingness to turn toward the past self, not with the intention of being defined by it, but with the clear and compassionate purpose of finally giving it what it has always needed. Acknowledgement, presence, the knowledge that it is no longer alone. Before we end today, I want to sit with you for a moment in something that does not often get said in the context of psychological education. This work is hard, not intellectually, though it can be that too, but emotionally. Turning toward the past self, recognizing its patterns, feeling the weight of what it has been carrying, all of this requires a quality of courage that is rarely acknowledged. Because it is not the dramatic courage of visible risk. It is the quiet, private courage of honesty, of sitting still long enough to feel what you have spent years outrunning, of choosing again and again to stay with yourself instead of escaping into the countless distractions the world generously provides. If you are here, if this content speaks to something real in your experience, that is not an accident. Something in you recognized itself in these words, some part of you that has been waiting patiently, and sometimes not so patiently, for exactly this kind of attention. That recognition matters. It is not just the beginning of understanding. It is the beginning of the relationship you have always actually needed, not with another person, not with an external system, but with yourself. The past self that you have been ignoring is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been carrying the heaviest weight for the longest time with the least support. It deserves to be seen. It deserves to be understood. And you deserve the life that becomes available when it finally is. I want to know what this brought up for you. Leave a comment below. What pattern do you recognize most clearly in yourself? What moment from your past do you feel most clearly in your present? Your words may be exactly what someone else here needs to hear. Share this video with someone who keeps returning to the same patterns and cannot understand why. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for someone we love is offer them the language for what they are living. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next video continues this journey, and if today resonated with you, you will not want to miss where we are going next. The work does not end here, and neither do you. See, script created for educational and transformative content, Carl Jung Psychology channel.